Bon après-midi,
Good afternoon.
bienvenue, merci.
Welcome.
Je suis le directeur du
My name is Jean Lebel. I'm a director of the Agriculture and Environment program at IDRC.
From you this afternoon at IDRC. Crown Corporation that is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year and has been throughout the 40th anniversary providing the Ottawa audience with speaker of renown. And today with us, we have David Waltner-Toews, who is a researcher that has been close to us at IDRC for many years, and that we want to bring to your attention as one of these pioneers in Canadian research world. I think as Canadian, we should all be proud of having a researcher like David Waltner-Toews. He was one of the early pioneers of the integrative approach to health. Integrative approach that consider human to be part of their ecosystem. And as we know, as a species, we closely interact with our environment, whether it's social, biophysical, whether it's through its economic dimension, and other. And I came to know David in 1997 when I joined IDRC as a young program officer in the environment health field before we had an Ecohealth program. And through his work on ecosystem health at the University of Guelph, where he is a professor at the Department of Population Medicine, Ontario Veterinary College, I came in contact with his work. It's early work that was taking place in Peru, in Nepal, in Kenya, later on in Honduras. David collaborated with colleagues from the developing world on research that link socioeconomic factor with biophysical element and community. The ecosystem health approach, the Ecohealth approach as we name it, treats complexity not as a roadblock, but really as a source of inspiration, as a framework to look at key issue linking health and environment. David is not only a researcher, he's an entrepreneur, I should say. He has been the founding president of Veterinarian Without Border, Vétérinaires Sans Frontières. He is also the
Veterinarians Without Border
for ecosystem sustainability and health. He has published widely in his scientific area of expertise, including veterinary medicine and epidemiology. And importantly, he has been providing the Ecohealth feed with 3 major textbooks, one that he put together, one with the late James Kay and his wife, as well as one with late Thomas Gitao in Kenya, all pieces that are quite important in the field for a new generation of researchers. Last summer, it's almost without any surprise, but a great pleasure that we learned that David received the inaugural award for outstanding contribution to the field of Ecohealth from the Association of Ecology and Health at their conference in London. And throughout his career, he has demonstrated a particular interest in a topic that I'm sure will be of interest to you. It's about food waterborne diseases as well as zoonoses. Diseases that are infectious and that can be transmitted from non-human to human or from human to non-human, animals to humans. He has also written on these topics, and I think there's 2 very well-known books on these subjects that some of you might have seen with memorable titles that have been published in the recent past. One is called Food, Sex, and Salmonella, Why Our Food is Making Us Sick. And even more suggestive, I have the copy over here, The Chicken Fight Back, Pandemic, Panics, and Deadly Disease That Jump from Animals to People. And this book was shortlisted as one of the finalists from the 2007 Canadian Science Writer Association Book Award. David come by his literary flair naturally. His first degree actually was in English literature, and he has been also publishing in that field. Poetry, essay, fiction that received the award, and even recipe book, I believe. With such a capacity for writing, David could have become a permanent resident in the ivory towers of academia. But I believe he has always been driven by action and inspired by contact with real people in the field, and I've seen this number of times. His career is a true illustration that you can link research and action to drive change that improve human condition and human health in particular. He has also been very generous here in Canada and abroad, and very influential in sharing his knowledge, including with students who attended his classes and whose academic work he supervised over the year, and I think there's over close to 40 of them now. And one of them is my colleague Dominique Charon, right here. Dr. Dominique Charon, who was a student of David and is now heading our ecosystem health program here at IDRC. So I think that you were quite lucky to have David as a supervisor. David continued to be closely engaged with Canadian community of practice in Ecohealth, and this is quite exceptional. It's a joint endeavor of University of Guelph, University of British Columbia, University of Quebec and Montreal, as well as University of Moncton, that provide a joint curriculum and ecosystem approaches to human health on a yearly basis with a group of students that are moving in this direction. So David, without further ado, it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you at IDRC to give us this lecture that you have entitled Ecohealth in a Complex World, Policy Holy Grail. I'm welcoming you once again. Thank you very much for being here with us and being also with our colleagues and friends that might be on the internet through the webcast and that will contribute with questions later on the screen. Welcome. I know in particular a group at University of Northern British Columbia with Dr. Margaret Parks that is there. Welcome to this keynote lecture. David, up to you.
I don't need that, no. Thank you very much, Jean, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to thank IDRC for the invitation to speak as part of this series, and also for many, many years of supporting innovative research for development, both in Canada and abroad. In the early 1990s, I arrived in Kathmandu for the second time. When I had been there in 1967 as a Kalo backpacker, Nepal was a quaint, isolated kingdom with a boy king and an alley called Freak Street. Now Nepal was a new democracy trying to come to terms with an influx of Gore-Tex, urban sprawl, and economic and political chaos. I was there as part of a team of scientists to study a tiny tapeworm that inhabits the intestines of dogs like a miniature wriggling grain of rice. In people and other animals, who serve as intermediate hosts, this parasite grows into a large tumor-like cysts full of baby tapeworms. My friends in Kathmandu, quite understandably, wanted to get rid of this parasite. It was a chilly morning when we walked down the hill and across the footbridge over the Bishnumati River. Fires flickered on the far bank, men and dark shapes of water buffaloes appearing and disappearing into the shadows. A buffalo, killed by a spike into the back of the skull, sank to the ground as one of the men moved in to slit its throat. In rubber boots, or barefoot, they piled straw over the body and fanned it into flames to burn off the coarse black hair, then stood back to watch. When the fires died down, they rolled the stiffening corpse onto its back, and one of them leaned over to slit open the belly. All along the riverbank, teams of young men waded through spilled guts, stomach contents, and feces, steam rising into the air around them as they quietly went around the business of preparing food for tourists and a rapidly expanding middle class. Dogs and pigs nosed in and out of the darkness at the periphery of this tableau. Vultures like great black fruits hunched in the nearby trees. We were scientists. We knew what to do. For 3 years, we did intensive epidemiological and laboratory research on people, on dogs, on buffaloes. We devised and delivered public health messages on radio, television, and through workshops. Nothing changed. I was in despair. If a team of clever epidemiologists and parasitologists and veterinarians could not even manage to rid one city of one tiny parasite, what was the point of it all? We begin with parasites in Nepal, but soon we are wrestling with malnutrition and food security, insecurity, mercury in fish, contaminated water, and epidemics of obesity and infectious disease. The world seems to be tumbling out of control. Diseases and catastrophes appear out of nowhere, and the old scientific, technical, and political agendas seem powerless and lack the economic and moral and intellectual resources to respond effectively. What are policymakers to do? Set a list of priorities and dollar for dollar go down the list? The list is endless. Worst of all, the ways in which we solve problems of hunger and unemployment create conditions for the emergence and spread of new diseases, or extinctions of species, or climate change, or riots in the streets. It is a political nightmare. If simple priority setting doesn't work, what are we left with? In conventional development and scientific terms, not much. Researchers do independent disciplinary work based on what Thomas Kuhn called normal science, a science where every discipline has its own immutable rules of practice, acceptable evidence, and quality control. The scholars then hand the results over to politicians, whom we expect to be much more thoughtful, insightful, and integrative and visionary than any university scholar. We then lament that the politicians make decisions based on someone else's evidence rather than our own. The policymakers are facing the prospect of rabies competing with child poverty and maternal health and population control and disappearing wetlands and whales and birds and pesticide pollution and avian influenza and cholera and hunger and childhood obesity and car accidents. The list indeed is endless and results only in more pleas for more money for more programs. There is a way through this. Let's go back to some basics. Scientists are hunters and gatherers. We gather facts, like fruits and nuts, in a confusing deep forest we call the world. We do not actually know the world. We perceive with our senses, eyes, ears, noses, tongues, hands, and our clever technological extensions of them. These inputs create a set of neural connections that function as a kind of internal mental model of what is out there. The mental model determines our behavior and our survival. Sometimes individuals are wrong. Sometimes a person's neural connections and biochemical messengers get mixed up, or they take a singular case to be of general applicability, or a person ends up in the wrong place at the wrong time because the landscape on which his brain connections were based has changed. Mistakes can be costly. An animal could be eaten, or run over by a car, or fly into a wind turbine. Or a person could eat something toxic, or the job for which they have been training for 10 years might suddenly disappear. Or an organization or way of doing things can suddenly become irrelevant. We overcome these deficits by sharing our data and our narratives, by critiquing each other, and by adapting to new insights as quickly as we can. We base these stories on personal experience, or a particular study, or better yet, a series of studies. This is no more nor less than a hunting tale recounted around a campfire, a way of constructing meaning from the facts. Good science is not just fact-finding. It is a systematic, open way to share experience, to offer alternative explanations, to project future possibilities based on past experiences. This is what differentiates a scientist from a pathologically compulsive data hoarder. The world is a tangle of feedback loops, tipping points, and nonlinear dynamics. But the task of understanding our place here is not hopeless. Just as fever and diarrhea are not separate problems to be solved, but expressions of a body in distress, so are many problems are symptoms of interactions among social and ecological changes. Most certainly, we have no one true description of our situation. What we have are the multiple perspectives of microbiologists and anthropologists, shamans and epidemiologists, ecologists and economists, farmers, sex workers, theologians, and musicians competing for our attention, each group assuring us that they have the truth. As good scientists and good development workers and good policymakers, we listen, because in a sense, they are right. We all collectively have the truth. Citizen engagement is not merely a way to make government policies palatable or scientific knowledge understandable. Public engagement is essential to do good science in a context where the facts are in dispute, values are contested, knowledge is uncertain, decisions are urgent, and decision stakes are high. The public participants are sources of evidence in the same way that a personal history, a physical examination, and a laboratory test inform a good clinical medical decision. Philosophers Jerry Revets and Silvio Fontowitz have called this post-normal science because it is not about overthrowing or replacing the many paradigms of science, but of accommodating all of them. It is a new democratic kind of science, open to differing interpretations of the facts. But what is the point of this open democratic science? Is it enough, as some might argue, to say that knowledge is power, and that this empowering of citizens should be a fundamental characteristic of any democratic society? And yet for policymakers whose work is to articulate principles to guide organizations, communities, and nations who wish to use that knowledge to improve the world, something is missing. A goal, a unifying vision. Policymakers suffer from the same disease that has plagued all of us. Economic and agricultural and health and energy policies seem to be crafted as if the world were actually divided up in such ways. But we already know that such a world is a fantasy. What sort of goal might transcend and integrate these? I'm going to propose that health can serve as the necessary unifying vision. René Dubos, one of the great public scientists of the 20th century, described health as a mirage, since it was forever shimmering somewhere on the horizon but never attained. But health is attained every day and reinvented and rejuvenated in every culture. It is not a mirage. Sensitive as it is to what people eat, who their friends are, the amount of sunshine, the weather in general, the quality of water, health is a renewable way of being. We all want to be in a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, which is how the World Health Organization defines health in its constitution, adding that it is not merely to be free of disease or infirmity. And most of us would not disagree with the proposition that this would be a good thing for all species and the planet we share, not just for some of the people, some of the time. Human health, animal health, ecosystem health. This is what the WHO and Centers for Disease Control and the Public Health Agency of Canada call One Health. This is our unifying vision. Of course, when we begin unpacking One Health, we open a Pandora's box. Whose health? That of North Americans, Africans, Asians, rich people, poor people, our children's children, non-humans, individual or population or ecosystem health. It is possible to pour millions of dollars into saving and vaccinating babies, and without equal attention to education, meaningful work, food security, we may make things worse, much, much worse for those children when they grow up. And if we pour millions into keeping older people alive, what does this mean for the draw on the resources needed for our children to have meaningful, fulfilled lives? If we advise people to change their eating habits to promote better personal health, and this leads to tropical deforestation to make room for soybeans and citrus trees, what might be the consequences of that? One Health in practice in real life forces us to deal with tragedy, loss, and suffering. Health for all can mean grief for many. So we have to grapple with all the cultural rituals, music, poetry, religion, with which we manage our grief. Yet the overarching idea of health keeps us together, keeps us talking, even as we struggle with the details. And in talking together, we are already creating the social bonds that foster good health. Conventional biomedical wisdom proposes that how we achieve health is irrelevant. All that matters is a diagnosis and a treatment, measuring type and burden of disease and targeting resources. Policies based only on technical expertise are almost always assuming that the world is stable, the future can be predicted, and therefore scientifically based policies will have beneficial effects. Many policies are created in a battle between technical experts and social pressure groups. This is what we tried in Kathmandu, and which failed. We could create a scientific model to predict that if you got rid of the street dogs, slaughtered all the buffaloes in government-inspected abattoirs, and had a professional cadre of sanitary engineers, Nepal would be a healthier place. But the shopkeepers and priests didn't want to get rid of the street dogs because they were acting as community police. Butchers didn't want to work in a state-of-the-art slaughterhouse because butchering was a family tradition. The women who cleaned the streets wanted daycare for their babies and education for themselves so that they could properly engage in public debates over waste management. And democratic change can be chaotic, and animal health inspection laws are not the highest priorities of new governments. Nepal is not unique. The experts can tell us not to smoke, to eat better, to exercise, to not let our dogs or chickens run in the street, to cycle, to recycle. Yet in the full knowledge of what we are doing, we resist changing our behavior. This is not because we are stupid. We all have defensible reasons for doing what we do based on the particular way we simplify that opaque and complex world out there, the models and lenses we use to understand it. The only sensible way to act in the face of this opacity is by engaging with others, sharing information, changing our minds, being humble in the face of an awesome universe. How we act is as important as the goals we set. Many of us have some idea what a scientific experiment might look like, but what might such a hybrid look like, where no one is an authority and the expertise is distributed among many people, where policies are the hypotheses and programs are the research, and where the outcomes are a lot more complicated than counting cases of diarrhea, tons of corn, or chickens sent to market. Over the past 15 years or so, a group of researchers from around the world have developed a general framework for doing this called an Adaptive Methodology for Ecosystem Sustainability and Health, or AMISH for short. Kind of like that, my Mennonite background. AMISH is a kind of rough guide to eco-health and proposes a circular series of about 7 steps and guiding questions. 1, what's the presenting complaint that brought us here? 2, who are the participants in this situation? What do they care about? What rules govern their behavior and decisions? Where do non-human species fit into this? 3, what are the stories told by the participants about how the situation came to be and their roles in it? 4, what are the scientific, cultural issues that need to be addressed and how are they related to each other? 5, what are the scenarios, visions, or narratives that are both feasible and desirable? 6, can we design a program to achieve our common goals? Who will implement this program? 7, what kind of a monitoring system will enable us to measure progress? Who will do this? How will that information be fed back into the system? And how can we make adjustments to our programs based on that information? There's no recipe, but there's an excitement of working with other people to find better, healthier ways to live on the planet. The ecosystem approach to health, or Ecohealth for short, brings together our best understanding of the historical, cultural, and ecological complexity of the world with a goal, one health, that transcends culture and history. With its dual familial heritage, Ecohealth reinvents science, acknowledging multiple kinds of evidence. It opens a space to struggle with tragedy, suffering, and contradiction, and for integrating interventions and policies for health, biodiversity, agriculture, social equity, and local democracy. Several years after our initial efforts in Nepal, we went back. This time, we expanded our research team to include community activists, butchers, squatters, shopkeepers, politicians, anthropologists, epidemiologists, and school children. Within 3 years, they had transformed their neighborhoods, created parks and gardens along the riverbank, built small-scale abattoirs, were composting the stomach contents from killed animals, raising ducks on the grubs growing in the compost, and selling the final product as fertilizer. They were thinking and working systemically, and policies in this mix mattered. The international policies of the Soviet Union and the United States, which led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, opened the door to new activist policies at the Butchers Association in Kathmandu. These policies, as they were implemented, made a space for the kind of transformational change we saw on the banks of the Vishnumati. It was not incidental to our success that set in a place of honor at the Butchers Association meeting hall were 2 pictures of young martyrs to the democracy movement, nor that the working policy of my primary collaborator, Dr. D.D. Joshi, was based on a commitment to improving the neighborhoods where he lived, no matter who held political power. Policies related to the war on terror led to increased turmoil and civil war in Nepal. The Kathmandu neighborhoods with whom we worked have not only survived, however, but have also extended their ideas to other communities. Their policies were positioned to be adaptive and to take advantage of, rather than be trapped by, changing social ecological conditions. In eco-health, in a sustainable society, the best policies are those that engage people where they live, address important issues in an evidence-informed, systemic way, and give spaces for many voices to be heard and many stakeholders to act. By drawing on a wide net of human experience, policies can anticipate several possible futures and be prepared for them. Finally, eco-health is more than just a way to solve problems. It can serve to speak across cultures. At a recent workshop on the epidemic of rabies in Bali, Indonesia, we were looking for ways to translate what at first might seem just another transplanted European idea into an effective, comprehensive local program. One of my colleagues, Dr. Anak Agung Gede Putra, a remarkable scientist, administrator, and traditional prince, talked about Hinduism in Bali and whether we might find something there. Trihita Karana, he informed us, comes from one of the Hindu holy books and advises seeking happiness in the here and hereafter through a harmonious relationship with God, with fellow humans, and with nature. What came to my mind were IDRC's principles of eco-health. Transdisciplinarity, a vision which transcends our imperfect disciplinary understanding, seems to me a kind of secular version of harmonious relationship with God. Equity, including gender equity and participation, harmonious relationship with humans. Sustainability, harmonious relationship with nature. Ecohealth, we decided, is a scientific and political reformulation of Trihita Karana. Also this October, I participated in a workshop puzzling over the relationship between biodiversity and indigenous health in the Amazon and the eastern slopes of the Andes, the Yungas. The workshop included physicians, anthropologists, epidemiologists, veterinarians, teachers, ecologists, naturalists. We were indigenous peoples, Argentinians, Canadians, Brazilians, Brits, Peruvians, and Colombians. Over a week, we argued, drew pictures, pored over maps, sang, danced, yelled at each other, cried, laughed, got drunk, checked with our social networks on Skype, made lists and organizational diagrams, came back to the table, and drew up a research plan. What we were forging was an uneasy sense of common vision. One health for people and the diverse other species with whom we share the planet. Mutual respect, finding a common narrative thread. One person suggested that their traditional way of dealing with those with whom they radically disagreed was to kill them. This workshop was outside their comfort zone. Well, this was outside the comfort zone of many of us. And yet I thought if we really want to have a good future, as many peoples among many species on this amazing planet, then we had better start putting away the guns and getting comfortable with this. A holy grail is something which is eagerly sought after because its possession is thought to bring physical and spiritual wholeness, well-being, and long life. Is eco-health in this complex world a kind of holy grail? If it isn't, then I think it is at least a wrinkled, partly obscured map, suggesting, can we not hope, a treasure? Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm on. Thank you. Thank you, David, very much. Take your time. The afternoon will go as follows. I will have a short conversation with David on the talk, and we will then move into questions from the audience. There's 2 microphones in the room. You'll be invited to come to the microphone and identify yourself, ask questions, make comments. And we will ask our also people that are on the web, on the webcast, to send in their question that we will have here on the monitor that we may decide to ask you or not, depending on the question.
We can pretend we don't see anything,
we
right?
can pretend we don't see it. That's how our afternoon will go, and we will close this around 3:30. But David, let's start the conversation here. In my introduction, I alluded towards the fact that your first degree was in English literature. You then became a vet, and then you decided to go towards epidemiology. And what is the common thread over here? What are the linkages? You know, how a young boy that was born, raised in Winnipeg, I believe, you know, came to develop this thinking?
Good question. I grew up in a family that was entirely humanities, historians. And I grew up in Winnipeg. I had no thought of ever studying science, but I had a very good high school science teacher. And then 1967, Trudeau said, do something for your country. So I hitchhiked to Montreal and I left the country. And I went around the world and ran out of money in India, and that's a long story. But I came back and I finished a degree eventually in English literature. Worked for a publisher for a year and realized if I wanted to be a writer, I would probably be a poor writer living in a garret somewhere. And I wanted to go overseas again, but with a set of technical skills of some sort. And I looked around and I thought, well, animals, right there, animals all over the world, I can work on animals. I don't even have to speak the language because a cow or a buffalo or a, you know, they're all very similar no matter where you are.
Dr. Doolittle.
Dr. Doolittle. And from that point on, I kept getting into trouble because I never quit asking why. Because if you have, well, this animal is sick. Why? Because something is circulating in this herd or they're not being fed right. Well, why is that? Well, there are some economic factors here or the soil factors or so. Well, why is that? And then I kept going and going and going. And so initially I got to epidemiology to look at distribution of issues in populations, and then food and waterborne disease. And then you immediately get into issues of culture and ecology because food and waterborne disease are intimately related to how we grow and distribute food and changing landscapes, and those are driven by social policies. And so all of those things, and I just kept asking why, and I realized that a lot of my fellow researchers would just stop. This animal is sick because it got this organism. Well, we'll treat it with this. End of story. But I was more interested in that those larger questions. Why were these things? Why did we see certain patterns of disease? Why were some people healthy and others not? And so I guess it's just I never got past being 5 years old. You know, why?
And still haven't found the answer.
I still haven't. No, I still haven't.
Now, you know, that's the introduction. Then let's jump into the eat. You know, ecosystem health.
Yes.
Ecosystem approaches to human health. One Health. Ecosystem and health. You know, there's so many nomenclature that have arisen over the year. But give us a little bit, you know, of where this was arising from. You know, what was the history before we got to that point, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s? What has been the progression that leads to where we are today?
History in 5 minutes here. The original idea was, from various sources, people said, veterinarians said, other people said, we can talk about the health of individuals. That seems to be not to be a problem. We can talk about, on the farm, about herd health, or people talk about community health, and we have measures of that. We have programs to promote that. And then the question came up, well, can we stretch that a bit? Is there, you know, can we talk about farm health or agro-ecosystem health, the health of the landscapes in which farms occur? Can we talk about the health of cities and the landscapes they are in? Can we project these ideas out? And that's where the original ideas of things like ecosystem health came. Taking health ideas and trying to apply them to these larger frameworks, these larger interests, ecosystems and so on. And some of us who were working in that realized that there were real problems with this because it's not so easy. You can measure temperature, pulse, respiration on a person. You can measure birth rates and death rates and disease rates in a population or community. But once you have this whole mess with all these things interacting, there's no easy way to measure ecosystem health if you want. So then some of us said, well, let's look at the process by which we do these. We try to achieve goals. So we have two things now. One is, what are we trying to achieve? And that's where I think One Health or ecosystem health and those things come in. And the other side is, how do we get from where we are now to there? Because the conventional scientific and political and other agendas and methods don't seem to work. They're not very good at trying to unravel those kinds of problems. And what I would run into in epidemiology was, well, we've got, if you're looking at all this complex interactions, we don't have ways of analyzing that. So we're going to ask this question over here. So instead of saying we've got an important question here for which we don't have a way of investigating it or analyzing it, let's find a way. The reproach was, well, we don't know how to deal with this, so we're going to deal with something we know how to deal with. You know, we know how to investigate whether a drug works or not. We know how to investigate whether this organism survives under these circumstances. But if you ask those larger questions, we don't know how to do that. And for me, that's where this whole ecosystem approaches to health came into play, because ecology is about relationships among things. So I spent a lot of time talking to ecologists, people like James Kay or Henry Regier, Tim Allen in the United States. How do those things relate? How do we look at things in sets of relationships rather than single outcomes? Because ecologists are used to doing that. And then how do we tie that to health outcomes, whether it's animal health, human health. The people I worked with, many of them were looking at environmental management issues, not even health issues. But the principles were the same in terms of how one begins to formulate a process for investigating and resolving some of these issues.
And thanks for this, but
that's not what you wanted to know.
Well, no, you're answering it, well. But let me push you a little bit further because I want to understand better. You have been at the forefront in the early days. Mm-hmm. This was, I think, truly a Canadian brand that developed early on. There was some influence from outside, but it was really a largely Canadian initiative. Mm-hmm. Scientific mm-hmm. approach mm-hmm. that was developing. And you're alluding towards, the health scientists and the environmental scientists that were on each side of a fence. And I think through these type of approaches, they start to develop a common languages. Why did it take place in Canada, in this 90 decade? And more importantly, from my experience also in the field, and we have been colleagues, why did it take place with Canadian, but outside of Canada? All the work that has led to the practice and the knowledge was not done in Canada, but outside of Canada in the early days. Why is that?
The simple answer is because IDRC gave money for that. But the more we asked each other those questions actually in the 90s, some of us working with ecologists and so on. It's interesting because there is a tradition. In Canada, there is a stronger tradition of looking at things systemically. And it's partly because of a much deeper suspicion in the United States of collective enterprises. There's a sort of hint that it might be socialist or something like that. And so that actually has spilled over into academia. So there was much more investigation into competition, even in ecology, looking at competitive species and those sorts of things. Whereas in Canada, and even the work that was done in the U.S. by people like C.S. Halling, he's actually a Canadian from Ontario, transplanted to the U.S., and then he developed all kinds of systems approaches. So there was more of an openness in Canada to doing that kind of work. Some of it was centered around the International Joint Commission of the Great Lakes. So there was a lot of activity in that area, a lot of people working on those things, trying to figure out how to integrate those things. Why it was done overseas, apart from the flip answer I gave at the beginning, part of it is that when you go overseas, and like I gave the description of Kathmandu, it's obvious. You have health, you have environment, you have economic development. You can't just separate it out. And we've had enough money in North America to say agriculture's over there, urban development's over there, health is over there, and we fund these separate things. In developing countries, in poor countries, they haven't had the luxury of kind of maintaining that kind of separation. And so, that's a large part of the answer. What's happened in North America is that there's been a whole flood of, if you want, natural feedbacks now with regard to pandemic diseases, particularly after Walkerton, that kind of thing, when people suddenly realized, oh, well, we've been thinking of agriculture over there and health over here and water engineering over here, but actually they're all part of the same world, right? We can't just have an agricultural policy over here that's completely separate from how we manage our water, that's completely separate from health policy. So that began to sink in, along with climate change and extreme weather events, and so there's been more of a move in that direction in Canada more recently. But I think it's largely because overseas, it's been easier because the problems are so obviously connected to each other. You have to be in a fantasy land if you think you can somehow separate them out.
And now let's bring it back on the Canadian territory. You are at Guelph. You are an active member of this community of practice and ecosystem approaches to human health. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the progress being made here in Canada? How would you describe in particular the interest that you are able to raise at the policy level in this country? Because this has been a key in developing world. Mm-hmm. These eco-health approaches have been working well when there's been active engagement, not only of the scientists with the community, but with the policy actor, and having, some way of translating the knowledge into action that can be taken up in public policy. In Canada, how do you see it how do you see it evolving? Is it present? Is there, you know, ground for this? Is there successes on the horizon?
It's there. I mean, there are a range of answers to that. One of them is that through this community of practice, we've had a lot of younger people move into the system, a lot of very interesting people from environmental sciences, social sciences, people working in northern Canada on climate change and health issues within the Public Health Agency of Canada, people working throughout the developing world on a variety of issues, and the community itself, which includes veterinarians and physicians and public health people and communications experts and a few philosophers asking difficult questions, keep prodding us and so on, and wonderfully bilingual, back and forth, pushing each other's language capabilities, which has been very good in terms of pushing our ability to think in more complex ways. So from that point of view, I'm very confident that there's a wonderful generation of younger people coming through the system. On the policy side, what I've found is that people just below the political level, assistant deputy ministers, heads of the CFIA or the Public Health Agency of Canada, there's a lot of interest at that level. And that's partly because these people think long-term, and they start thinking integratively at that point, because they've been around long enough to see that there are interactions among all of these things. At the political level, it's much more challenging because there's all this turnover all the time, and the people are looking over their shoulder, they're looking toward the next election, they're looking toward the next cabinet shuffle, and so that there's much less ability on their part to look at these things. And so I see progress being made at the higher levels, at the ADM level, but I see the big challenge is being translate that into political programs, and I'm not quite sure how to do that. I think in part we need the public on side, because the politicians are going to respond to the public, and so these kinds of debates need to be made in public.
Okay. My last question to you before we go to the audience and to the microphone. We have a number of case studies of Ecohealth research that have demonstrated impact at a very local level, sometimes a little bit, at a broader scale, but we don't have, storytelling that is telling that this is applicable everywhere in every situation. Is this a downside of the type of approaches that you have been, and that I've been working on over the years? And if so, what can be done in order to get to a next step? What is the future?
Well, it is a challenge because coming in as an epidemiologist, I was used to large numbers, right? You need large numbers, randomly selected, and so then you can do statistical analysis. We're dealing, the bigger your unit, you go from a community to a valley to larger units, you have fewer of them, and the diversity is so great that it's very difficult to extrapolate from one place to another, which is one of the reasons many of us focused on the process rather than the specific outcomes, because the process, you can move from Kathmandu to Argentina to Kenya, and the general process remains the same. The kind of guiding questions with regard to who's involved, what are the issues, how does this relate to the environment around them, but the specifics are going to change from place to place. I see it a little bit like, if you look at the initial reports of HIV/AIDS or E. coli 0157H7, they weren't large-scale studies. They were individual case studies. And people who are pathologists, people who are individual physicians, are used to looking at a range of information, clinical information, narrative histories, laboratory tests, pulling all of this stuff together and saying, this doesn't quite fit things that we've seen before. This seems unusual here. But we're going to make a decision based on the best available evidence and then see what happens. And I think we're a little bit at that point in the process with Ecohealth. We're past sort of the initial few cases, and we're starting to move into situations where we can actually begin to demonstrate. Now, there are a variety of things. I know Thomas Katau in Kenya used to say, well, there are some things we can measure immediately. How many projects have these communities initiated on their own? Did they fix the road? What about the water system? Those sorts of things. There are other kinds of things that you can look at longer term, behavioral changes. Are these communities changing the way they produce and distribute food, the way they manage their ecosystems, and those sorts of things? The higher you go up in that system, the less it's amenable to project a kind of project boundary. And the more I think there's a greater role for organizations like IDRC to in fact look at globally, what can we say globally when we compare all of these things? Because when you're within a project, you can kind of look at 2, 3, 5 years, and you can say, well, we'll come back in 10 years and see what's happening. And I've had the luxury, if you want, in Nepal of being able to see that it has been ongoing. They've been able to do new things and keep going. But that's not a very long, if you're talking about sustainability, 10 years isn't a long time, right? So it's a challenge, but I don't think we should back away from it. I think we should say, okay, it's a challenge. How are we going to do this?
Thank you. Well, let's move to the audience now and ask for your question or comments on the presentation that David gave us and on the broad topic of environment and health. So there's one microphone over here, the other is there. Si vous voulez vous exprimer.
If you want to speak French, there's no problem. There are simultaneous interpretation services. If you need headsets, you can go and get them.
And we'll take a round of 3 questions to give the opportunity to David to prepare the answers. Sir, please, can you identify yourself?
Yes, my name is Dr. Prabir Nyogi. I work for Industry Canada, and I ask this question naturally in a purely personal capacity. It's a 2-part question. The first is the ability of our, quote, scientific and engineering methodology to study complex systems, because, you've quite rightly pointed out that this is difficult to do. There are 2 very famous precedents. One is the building of the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, and the other is the Apollo program, where systems thinking was required to make these 2 happen. And the question I ask is the ability to think of complex systems improving with time? That's one question. The second question is this question of generalization. How do you take the experience gained in the streets of Kathmandu, for instance, and apply it to let's take an example, the 620,000 villages in India, where I come from, and the 700 million people. These are 2 very separate questions, and you might wish to tackle one or the other or both.
Thank you for your question, and I have a second question here, sir.
Oui, bonjour.
Hi, François Couillard.
I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Canadian Red Cross and of VON Canada. Before that, I worked in business a lot. So I'd like to thank you for your talk, for your concepts. I think it's very innovative, and it's very exciting to see these sort of types of conceptual thinking. I'm trying to apply this in a real-world situation, and how can you actually enact changes in the social or health systems that we have. And you talk about this concept of transdisciplinary. Does that go as far as extending to business? So what is the role of business in these concepts? And I'm thinking of a speaker you had here a few months ago, Professor Mohammed Yunus, Nobel Peace Prize winner, who talks about social business. So can social business have a role in helping solve social and health problems by using some of your concepts of eco-health? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And is there another question? No. So, David, why don't we start with these 2 questions?
It's true that projects like the atomic bomb and Apollo used a lot of systems thinking. I think what emerged, particularly during the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment globally, was a sense that that kind of systems thinking was, in fact, limited. Let me explain. They made the differentiation between what they called complicated systems and complex systems. So a complicated system, you could create a mathematical model and you could predict the outcome. So you can create a set of mathematical models that are related to each other and said, if we have this thrust and this amount of fuel and this structure, we can land a craft on Mars. And that they would call a complicated system. A complex system, they would say, is raising children. You can do all kinds of things, and you're probably better off if you do some things than if you do other things. But there's no mathematical model you can build that's going to predict the outcome. And so if you ask if there's been progress in systems thinking, I would say yes, because there was a sense in the 1970s and 80s in, for instance, farming systems research, where the idea was that you could apply kind of engineering models to understanding a farm. But that, of course, that works if you don't include people, right? As soon as you put people in there, we're not nearly as predictable. I mean, we're predictable maybe in a very broad scale, which is not as helpful in terms of ongoing activities as one would like. In terms of applicability across different places, I think that that's one of the things we've been learning, which is why when we first started thinking about this, I had one project in Peru in the Peruvian Amazon, one in Nairobi, just a peri-urban project, and one in downtown Kathmandu, just to see if we try to implement some of these things, what would that mean? And so some of the guiding questions and things I talked about emerged from those different places in different ways. And it's one of the reasons we went to a more guiding question approach, if you want, rather than prescriptive. If you do this and this and this and this, then you will get this outcome. Because it was quite clear that it really depended on the context, what kinds of activities might be useful and not. And so I think we're at a point where when we have gatherings of people, of Ecohealth people from around the world, there is a sense that there are a lot of things that we can talk about in terms of process, and in some cases in terms of outcome. This works and this doesn't work, and I think you're seeing that with IDRC too. There were a lot of hit and miss at the beginning, and sometimes it just, it didn't work. And I suggested, on reflection, for instance, in Kathmandu, one of the reasons it was successful was because, quite frankly, the Berlin Wall came down, there were democracy movements all over the world, the monarchy fell, and people in Kathmandu wanted to try something new. And so there was an opportunity, there was kind of activity that people said, well, here's something new, let's try it. Kind of energy there. So that doesn't mean that what we did didn't make a difference, but it did mean that we took advantage of things that were happening already. And I think that's one of the things that happens in Ecohealth. That one of the reasons I think it doesn't work in some places is because the power structures are so well entrenched and so well funded that it's very difficult to shift them around. This issue of social business and so on, I come out of a background that's very suspicious of business. It's 1960s and all of this kind of stuff. But I've actually learned something through this whole process, and that is that working with different groups of people toward common goals. Nobody wants to destroy the communities where they live. I mean, it was interesting in this, the cause of the damage in the whole downtown neighborhoods where we worked in Kathmandu was all the butchering and so on that was going on. But when I talked to them later on, and they said the big thing about the project we had was they got everybody around the table. And they had never sat around the table before with the political leaders and with the small shopkeepers and the street sweepers and the squatters. And the changes that I described in that neighborhood were not because of a massive foreign aid project. They were because they started reinvesting their own money in their own community. Because they said, okay, we're part of this community. We want to reinvest. We live in this place too. We want it to be a good place. So it's, I think one can appeal to the better instincts of people who are in various kind of business. Of course they want to make money, but they don't want to make money at the expense of destroying the environment for their kids. I mean, I think people get pushed into extreme positions. And I think if you begin to pull them in and say, well, let's find some common threads here, right? And it's not easy to do that. I mean, one of the questions on here is about the corporate world and about politics and so on. Can we transcend politics? Is it okay if I respond to that?
Well, I was going to go to the screen for the question, exactly that one. So why don't you read it?
Do you think that in pursuit of eco-health policies or One Health policies, can really transcend politics? If the way we negotiate global difference is based on democracy, which is dictated by the changing of political ideologies on a generally regular basis, how can we sustain and implement health policies within such a regular change, say every 5 years, in political fashion and fad? And then the next one has to do with the corporate world.
Well, let's go to the first one here, well, this challenge between, the long-term research needed before we start to see some impact sometimes, and the short-term politic agenda, which is not unique to
that's why I think that, we've seen in my experience in Canada has been it's not the regularly elected political leaders that have been most responsive. It's the people just below that, the people, you know, assistant deputy minister, people that are in a bureaucracy for a longer period of time, that they're perhaps more open to those kind of things. There's also a resistance actually in the middle level. So somebody's been doing something for 10 years or 15 years in a particular way. Their career has been based on it, and now we're asking them to change. I mean, that's tough. I mean, even any of us, you know, you're doing a job a certain way, and then somebody comes along and says, actually, we're going to completely restructure, and you're now going to do a completely different job. Never happens at IDRC, right? You're not going to say because David's in the room over here.
I'm asking the question.
So I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying, and another part of that is I think there's a responsibility for people doing this kind of work to engage with the media, to engage with the public, because we're actually talking about cultural change here. We're talking about a long-term cultural change. And we can see what happens if somebody, you look at Obama's, you know, health care in the States. Well, he had all the town hall meetings and everything, and we see what happened to that. Some of that is timing. Some of that is just shows that it's very difficult, in fact, to get people to start thinking in different terms, to start thinking systemically, and to make those kinds of changes. I don't think that means we should stop doing it, but I think it is a challenge. And I think, no, it doesn't transcend politics, but I think we need to engage in different ways in a political realm. I found that, you know, I have certain biases in terms of political parties and those kinds of things. But I found if you go to individuals within different parties, nobody is really out to destroy the world, right? They really want to try to do something good. And if you can engage them at that level and bring in some evidence and say, how can we do this and this and this, that often you can get people to engage. Not always, but often you can.
And thanks to Madame Giselle Corin-Singh, I believe, if I'm pronouncing her name well, for sending in question. If you are on the web sending question, can you limit yourself to 1 or 2 lines? You know, if you send 7, 8 line paragraph, it's quite tough for me to read while I'm listening to David. Do we have question in the audience? You? Yeah, please. Yes.
You have to forget, I'm Shannon Griffiths. I'm not a scientist, I'm a journalist. It's off the record for me. You've been to a lot of communities in stress around the world, communities in crisis. I was wondering if you'd had a chance to assess the ecosystem health in Canada. There's much talk about polluted waters, stressed waters, depleted waters, water's a source of life, etc. And I was just wondering if you were in a position to assess the health here. Is it better than we'd like? Is it worse than we'd like? Is it a cause for concern?
Yes. There has been a shift in terms of our interest in those issues since Walkerton and since climate change, climate variability has become more and more of an issue in Canada. And there are some programs, people looking at watersheds and looking at how do we think about whole watersheds and the health of people and animals and how water is managed in those watersheds, because it's a natural kind of ecological boundary. So there are research programs, I think through SHRC and through some other programs. The Public Health Agency of Canada has something called CenterNet, which is an integrated watershed monitoring system, which they started actually in the watershed I live in, the Grand River watershed, which happens to have a lot of parasites in it because of the farms and the cities and all mixed up together. And then they're moving on to other watersheds across the country. So there is work in that area. I mean, there are 2 answers to that. One is there is cause for concern, partly because of rapid urbanization and mixed with agriculture in certain watersheds across the country. There's concern about how lands are managed in different parts of Canada. I had something else in mind, and I can't think of it right now. The other side of that is that we're pretty well off in Canada relative to the rest of the world. I remember there was a One Health consultation in Winnipeg last year, and meeting somebody from Australia there, Julia Lanford, who some of you know. Yeah. And she was saying she was astounded flying over Canada how much water there was. In Australia, you would never see that much water, you know? And so that doesn't mean we should be reckless with it. It means globally, it's a very precious resource. And we need to find ways to better work with the water we have, to manage it carefully, to nurture it. And we are, Canada's actually a pretty nice place to be globally. You know, I'm always glad to come home. I know my wife is always glad when I come home, but that's a different issue.
I have here, thank you, David. Thank you for your question. I have one question over here, David, that I think is of interest. First, thank you for your insightful lecture. And the question is, given that Ecohealth is seen as a Canadian initiative, largely still, do you think in the next 5-10 years, the ownership of this discipline will still be interesting to Canadian researcher and academia, given that most of its applications are in developing country? That would be, you know, that's the question from someone on the web. I would add to this, you know, how do you see it also evolving in developing region of the world? Because I think that's one place from an IDRC standpoint that we want to make a difference, and where you have been actively involved.
Right. Well, there are two parts of that. I mean, it's a Canadian initiative. Will Canadian researchers still be interested in academia? I think so, because a lot of these issues are in fact coming home. I mean, the globalization of the world and so on. And so how agriculture is managed in Costa Rica or Guatemala or Morocco actually influences the food we have here as well as their health over there, right? So suddenly we have an interest in where these foods came from and what's going on in those countries and how their ecosystems are managed, which is where the title of the book, Food, Sex, and Salmonella, came from, right? That we can't get closer to an environment than by eating it and putting it into our bodies, which is what we do when we eat. So then the question is, which environment are we becoming intimate with and what's going on in that environment and so on. So I think there is a long-term interest in those kinds of integrative questions. In terms of ownership, I've seen more, it varies around the world. My initial reaction is that in Latin America it seems to go fairly quickly. And it's partly because people are actively politically engaged and they're asking questions and there's something of turmoil, so they have this openness to new ideas, and there's a history of, if you want, social epidemiology, they might call it, in Latin America, and political ecology and various kinds of combinations like this. So it seems to be easier to talk about these things in that context. In Southeast Asia, it's a challenge, but in a different way. And there's going overseas, I mean, there are all kinds of things that go on, obviously. The booming economies in Southeast Asia, but there's also, and this is a huge generalization, more of a deference to authority that I'm coming in to teach, and so what are you going to teach me, right? Rather than grappling with and challenging back and those kinds of things, which is really at the heart of an Ecohealth kind of approach, is people asking questions, why? And that hasn't been a strong tradition in parts of Southeast Asia. Now, I see it coming out in various places. There's some Fang Jing, for the Chinese researcher, and Xu Jianchu, people like this who are very actively engaged in doing things and asking questions, and they kind of work within their own political systems, sort of kind of working at the boundaries, doing some very interesting things. So there is some change there, and I can see ownership shifting to other parts of the world. In parts of Africa, there's a lot of variation. Again, I'm happy to see people run with it, change it, adapt it, and say, well, yeah, you can do this in Canada, but we're going to have to change it to work with it here, and it's because it's a different context. But I think that general sense of thinking systemically, of local ownership of issues, this came out in Bali when we were talking about rabies. They said, yeah, we've got millions of dollars coming in from the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and from AusAid, and everybody wants to prevent rabies from spreading outside of Bali, which has never seen it before historically. And we want to maintain local ownership of this. So we need to manage this somehow. And there's thinking systemically and trying to do this. So I'm actually quite hopeful.
Okay. Thank you. Sir?
My name is Brian Elliott, and for the purpose of this question, I'll identify myself as a geographer.
Okay.
But I've also worked overseas with humanitarian NGOs in public health. I'm in the professional sports idiom, I'm 110% with you. Please keep that in mind. But I have to look at question you, challenge you in your perception that getting out there and talking about One Health is the strategy that will work. For example, today in the Guardian newspaper, there was a report of an Indian politician who is coming out and saying that India must avoid the American development model. He's a businessman as well. Now, I didn't have time to peruse all that goes behind that, but this is a very important point in the sense that my challenge to you is this. When the streams run out, you can't drain Lake Erie. You can't drain the streams. You've reached well beyond disaster point when you reach that point. And this is the issue that is actually an overarching issue, is avoiding disaster. Walkerton was a minor event. SARS was a minor event. The One Health approach could avoid those things in the future, but it won't if your policy, if your projection of speaking out and going to the public fails to also give the message, not that the sky is falling, but that the option is disaster. Okay?
Thank you. And there is a tension between, if you want, disaster response and long-term health, and it is a challenge. And the example that I use is that if I've been hit by a car and I go into the hospital, I don't want to negotiate with the emergency room physician over what he's going to do, or what she's going to do. I expect that there's a chain of command. They know what to do. They respond, and so on, which is completely different than if we're talking about community health. Having said that, trying to navigate this path, if you want, between the fact that we're working at the edge of massive resource depletion, water depletion, and big shifts in climate, those kinds of things, and we're trying to get people to think systemically. That is a challenge. I guess what I would do is I would start with what I said was present a complaint. Start with where people actually have a concern now, and then begin to work outwards and say, okay, how does this relate to that? How does this relate to that? How does this relate to that? And then tie it back into water issues, climate issues, those kinds of things. I wasn't suggesting that. I think if somebody comes out and starts talking Ecohealth or One Health, actually, from my point of view, my eyes glaze over fairly quickly, because you start with very specifics. What am I going to eat today? Where's the water coming from? And then you can look out and say, well, is that water going to be there in the future? How are we going to manage that? So I think there are ways of working with those issues in such a way that you can acknowledge that we are close to some sort of limits, and at the same time hopefully think about what does it mean to have resilient or healthier societies in the globe. That's not an easy thing to do, and yet I think it's probably, well, I think it is worth doing. Because if we're constantly doing short-term, then we can dig ourselves into a trap fairly quickly, because we've done so much of that short-term work. We solved the food problem at the end of World War II by going to economies of scale and global trade, and that has created all kinds of havoc with environment and with subsequent public health problems that have arisen from that. It's true, we've got lots of cheap chicken on the market, and we were able to solve that problem, but we did so by, in fact, pulling resources from a whole bunch of other places and creating havoc in other places. And I think by thinking systemically and bringing in lots of different voices, we can at least begin to move in a direction where that's less likely to happen. I'm not saying we can avoid it completely, but I think I would rather try to work that way than I've got environmental colleagues who would be happy if there was if you want, an environmental pope, basically just told everybody what to do and they had to do it. I wouldn't be happy living in a world like that. You know, there's a part of me that says I'd rather us go down as a species doing good things together than trying to save each other in some drastic kind of way.
But David, I'm going to keep you a little bit on that track over here and following up, because, you know, we might sound like preaching.
Yep.
You know, that's something that we have heard many times towards Ecohealth. You are preaching. You know, everyone is in agreement with you, but what does this change in the real world? And I think that's, you know, a fundamental question that, you know, we have difficulty answering from time to time when we're in the field, because, you know, we have those results that are at local level and we're having difficulty to translate it at a higher level. And my question to you would be, you know, we're training a generation of researchers now that take this as an approach in their domain, whether in Canada and developing country of the world. Will they make a difference? Will there be an audience for them? Is there a place for them to operate, you know, outside of the grants from IDRC or outside of the grants from the NIH or CIHR?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, IDRC has obviously been pushing in that direction, capacity building and those kinds of things. But I also see it, this recent workshop in Bali, there were people there from government, people from various institutions, and they're carrying these ideas out, and it's not exactly the same, and they're modifying them and so on. We had this workshop in Argentina with people from half a dozen countries and very different ethnic backgrounds and people who radically disagreed with each other. And at the end of the week, we were able to accommodate each other, and some of them were leaders of networks of indigenous peoples. And I think there is and it wasn't called Ecohealth, it was called something else. I don't care what it's called, but I think that kind of engagement with people and looking at these things systemically is really important. And I see one of the questions here is on human-centered. I'll just flag onto that. That my sense is that nature doesn't care if we're here or there one way or another, right? Nature doesn't care if things turn into a desert. We care. We would like to have a planet with lots of different species that's sustainable, where we can share it in the long run, have a convivial existence on this planet. If we want that, then what does that mean in terms of how we engage with other species on the planet? I mean, it's us that care, right? So ultimately, it becomes a value question. What do we value? And there's no scientific answer to that. So in some sense, you have to take a stand and say, these are the things that I think are important, that I value. And I value the fact that there are lots of species on this planet. I value the ecological services, not just in terms of what they provide to us and what they can provide to our grandchildren, but just the sense of the world, all of those wonderful things around us. And I see that, I don't know, this question started and kind of went off like this. One of the challenges, in fact, has been to get ecologists involved in this. And it's partly because ecologists have traditionally dealt with systems in which there are no people. We're going to manage a park over here. We're not interested if there are people involved, because people are, by definition, a bad thing, just by definition. So the ideal ecosystem is one with no people in it, so we'll put some people in it, and then by definition it becomes worse. So can we prevent it from becoming too much worse? And my philosophy is different. We are another animal in the system, and we have different influences on it. Whether we're a bunch of elephants or whether we're a bunch of people, we're parts of these ecosystems. So what does that mean? How can we be respectful to other members of this ecosystem to sustain it and to maintain it? It's good for us, it's good for other species.
Okay. I don't see anyone on the microphone. There's one gentleman, I'll come to you. There's 3 rapid things that we can touch and go on the screen over here. And they are really, you know, question that relates on the applicability of this in different contexts. And maybe you can just give glimpse of your perspective. There's one person that is asking, how would you apply your ID to First Nation community in Northern Ontario? I think that you can answer this fairly rapidly. Another one coming from Université de Sherbrooke, asking, you know, what are the links that you're making between the management of waste in developing country and Ecohealth approach? And I think you've talked quite extensively of this with the Nepal situation. And the third one would be, you know, how do you see applying Ecohealth concept differentially in developing country? I think we touch on this, but rapidly on these 3 points.
First one, First Nations, there is work going on, actually through the Public Health Agency of Canada has some work, Victoria Edge. Sherry Lee Harper is one of the graduates of our Canadian Ecohealth program, working with First Nations communities on climate change and water disease and so on. There are some of the people working on climate change, some of the geographers working up north, Barry Smith and so on, James Ford at McGill University, are working with communities in the north to try to combine good scientific evidence with digital storytelling, with, you know, a whole bunch of other things. And so those approaches are in fact being used across the north, and I think I don't see any big issues with that. I mean, I shouldn't say it that way. I don't see any unusual issues that don't arise in other poor communities that are under duress and at the periphery of power, if you want.
Waste management.
It's an interesting one because there are more than 2 ways to look at it. One of the ways to look at it is to treat waste management as, you know, we want sustainable manure management, sustainable waste management, which is a kind of industrial way to look at it. The other is to begin to think ecologically, because waste is just stuff that's where we don't want it to be, right? I mean, it's still biological material of various kinds, non-biological material. How do we think about where things came from, how they're being recycled, where they go, and those kinds of things? And I think then it begins to become less of an industrial problem, if you want, and becomes more of how can we redesign how we produce and distribute food and products, and what does that mean for our impact on ecosystems and so on. So thinking more ecologically about that kind of activity, I think, is important. The differential between developing and developed countries, one of the things that I didn't talk about but that is emerged in the systems literature is a sense of nestedness, if you want, that you can look at. I'm an individual with my own boundaries and my own sort of internal physiology and rules, but I'm a little bit leaky, right? I take things in and things come out, and my skin is leaking and various other parts and so on. I'm part of a family, and that family has its own rules and internal dynamics, but it's sort of got a boundary. And that's part of a larger community, and that's part of a larger community. Well, at some point, globally, we're all part of some global community, and those interactions matter. That what I do in my own household, and then I start crossing these various boundaries, has impacts in other countries, and vice versa. So I think if we begin to think in those terms, then we look at not simply of international trade or high GDP and low GDP and those kind of things, but how are we interrelated with each other? So for instance, I see if you bring feeds from Brazil and you move them to Sweden to feed the cows, you're not simply moving feed from one part of the world to another. You're actually taking nutrients out of the ground in Brazil, you're putting them into cows in Sweden, who are dumping out a lot of it into the soils in Sweden, where it becomes a manure problem, right? So we're restructuring the ecosystems in Brazil, and we're restructuring the ecosystems in Sweden. People tend not to think in those terms, but I think we need to begin thinking in those terms to look at our connectedness. If you look at the food system, there are all these hidden ecologies. We have, when I was in Indonesia a few years ago working on avian influenza, there was a team from Indonesia in Ottawa because they were concerned about the meat and bone meal from the Canadian meatpacking industry that was being shipped to Indonesia. They were concerned about getting BSE, right? Most people don't even know that this trade exists, but that stuff goes to Indonesia, and they make it into fertilizer, and they put it on flowers, and they ship the flowers to Europe. There's this kind of hidden ecology in our international trade and agriculture, and I think we need to pay more attention to that.
Thank you. We will have, I think, one last question, two last questions. Sir, and we'll wrap it up afterward. Please identify yourself and your question.
Pedro London, just a citizen. The 7 principles you mentioned there, you mentioned in a certain order. Is that order sequential indeed or just casual?
Which
is the research the sequence of, sorry, we missed your question, sir.
Principles.
The Ecohealth principles?
Principle.
Yes.
Are they sequential? The 7 from the Amish that you
No,
provided?
the IDRC principles. The
Amish, yes.
Oh, the Amish steps.
The Amish.
Yeah, what tends to happen is that as soon as you begin to engage with people, some of these things go very quickly and you have some immediate responses. I remember in the Peruvian Amazon, the researchers said, well, one community said, we need a boat right now in order to be able to do our fishing, right? So we'll work and we'll help you get a boat, and then we'll talk about the longer term issues, right? So some of these things, it's not, it's less a sequence than it is, these are things that we should probably pay attention to. So we need to pay attention to the people and the issues. We need to pay attention to how these things are related to each other, the culture and the ecology, and then we need to pay attention to how can we negotiate the trade-offs here in order to come to some kind of a common vision of where we want to go.
And we have to have all of them.
I'm going to say yes. I think so. What tends to happen if you take one thing out, there's a long history of participatory research internationally. So people go out and they participate and they do all kinds of things. To what end, right? It's nice, you participate. Maybe it's good for democratic institutions and so on, but sometimes people just get disappointed because they've been engaged in a process, but it has no particular outcome. If you focus on just systems thinking, then you can take that out of context. You can go back to the laboratory and create all kinds of fancy systems, these spaghetti diagrams, but they're not engaged with people. They don't have any particular, they don't engage with people where they live, so they don't have any connection. So it seems to me one needs to have those things. And then to have some policy implication, some action implication is important, because if you work with people and you begin to describe how things are connected to each other, and then you say, well, okay, that's very nice, we understand a lot of things, and you go away, they go, what was the point of that exercise, right? If we don't engage with people and find some ways to, how can we improve life on the planet somehow, and find ways to measure that if you want, then I think we haven't been responsible as researchers.
Thank you.
Among them, is there a priority? Or are there priorities?
Is there a priority? I think there are two parts to it. One is to pay attention to what's around, to think systemically, to, you know, if you're a hunter and you're focused on something, but to keep your peripheral vision open. So you might be focused on a particular health outcome, but you're looking around you. I think that's a priority. The other is a mutual respect, working with other people, that engagement, that respect for other people. Because I see a lot of, one of the early responses actually in Kathmandu from one of the government ministers at the time was, he saw this as a new form of, if you want, imperialism. You know, Western scientists coming in and kind of pushing their agenda. And I'm sensitive to that, because I think that is a danger in doing this kind of work, that we're pushing our agenda on other people. So I think backing off a little bit, spending a lot of time listening, looking at the connections between things, trying to be some sense of solidarity with other people around the world, those kinds of things.
A final one, I'm sorry.
I'll have to interrupt.
Where does the politics come into this?
You already have 3 questions, and we have 1 more speaker. I'll give the opportunity to other speaker. My apologies. Sir.
Thank you. Martin Morello from IDRC. You alluded to the fact that the human beings are another animal of the system. And I would like to know, what do you believe in balance of nature? And what are the roles of technology and business, market economy?
This is one question.
Just because we are selling things that have been created for millions of years, like oil, for $50 a barrel.
Yep.
And so I was wondering, just in general, what do you think on balance, given those two important things?
And of course, you're talking about consumption, and of course, layered over that is a question somebody else asked on here, which has to do with population, which is something we shy away from. We don't want to talk about this anymore because it's such a political bombshell, right? I think we need to readdress that, there, you know, in terms of global population. Some of that is beginning to actually work its way through the system. If you look at the one-child Chinese and their children, some of them aren't even having any children, right, because of the changing situation. So there are some changing dynamics, and we need to pay attention to that. That the consumption issue, the balance is again, I come down the middle somewhere. I remember working on this in the 90s and talking about, on the one hand, there were people who were really pushing what they called ecological integrity, so stable ecosystems, a kind of balance of nature kind of thing, and at the other end were what I would call an American attitude. Everything is changing anyway. You know, we've always been crossbreeding animals. The fact that we're doing genetic engineering now, the fact that it's way faster than it's ever been before in history, that's irrelevant. The fact is everything's changing, it will always change. And his response, this guy happened to be a theologian, he said, oh, those were the same debates that they had in Nazi Germany in the 1930s among the theologians. And guess who won? The local integrity people, because they said hearth and home and stable local systems and all of this kind of thing, that's what we want, right? And of course, then there's been this huge swing about it's a free-for-all. Anybody can do what they want. You know, freedom for everybody to just do what they want. I think what we want is something in between, where there's a kind of resilience but openness to change, where there's an acknowledgement of the limitedness of the resources, but at the same time the ability to use those resources to foster better lives, not just for people but for other species on this planet. So it's, people tend not to be satisfied with my answers because people want to have one or the other, but I think our way through is somewhere in the middle on this. And I think we really need to engage at that level to say, you know, the free-for-all is an extreme, but the absolute ecological integrity is a kind of extreme too. We need to have some integrity, some basis, some ongoing stability, some balance if you want, but we also want to be open to change. How we maneuver that, that's why I focused so much on process. How do we begin to engage with different people? How do we begin to look at things ecologically, to look at other species in such a way that we can keep this kind of balance, if you want?
Well, David, you know, we come to the end of our talk this afternoon. There's still, you know, plenty of questions. I have questions from University of Montreal, from University of Reading in United Kingdom. We'll look at it afterward if you're interested into. I want to thank people on the web for their attendance and their participation to our discussion this afternoon. I want to thank you all in the audience for participating, providing good questions, insightful comments. And before I thank you, David, I'm going to ask you, for our audience over here, that is composed of people that are coming from the academia, the student, people that have been active in the field, from the civil society organization. We've touched a number of things. We started with a story in Nepal, and throughout the journey, we went to some higher hands, some stratospheric. We came back to the ground. What is the take-home message over here? What would you like this audience to bring back home tonight and say after they have listened to you and to the conversation this afternoon?
This planet is worth caring about, and it's important to pay attention to what's going on around us, to listen to other people, to pay attention to other species. And people have sometimes accused me of talking or thinking outside the box, and my answer is well, I do see boxes. We're in the city here in Ottawa, but in real life there are no boxes. The boxes are in here, right? In real life these things are all connected, and to try to maintain that sense of of the fullness of life, if you want, on this planet, and caring about it and trying to find ways to engage to keep it going, to keep it alive, to keep life on this planet as interesting and as convivial as possible for all of us.
Well, on those words, we're going to thank you for your time this afternoon, for this talk, for the conversation with our audience. I want to take this opportunity also to thank our people that are in translation, as well as our technical person there, our webcast people, and the communication team of IDRC. David, it's always a pleasure to welcome you at IDRC. It was even a greater pleasure to have you as one of our speakers of renown for the 40th anniversary of the center. Thank you again, and have a safe drive or walk back home. Thank you very much for your attention.